The next speaker will be Professor Gabriel Bacone. He is professor of economics at the University of South Florida. The title of his talk is Accounting for Partial Observability, a Multiple Stage Duration Model.
I give it to her. I have it here too. But she uploaded it too.
Yes, yes, yeah, here.
Control with this. Yes, it works. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. That was a lot of help. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. The title of my presentation is Accounting for Partial Observability, a Multiple Stage Duration Model. And this is joint work that I have done with Frank and Arsini, who are here, and Tom Ross. So let me start trying to motivate my presentation. For many empirical problems, the main variable of interest is the time spent on a particular state, right? In this kind of model, we usually also want to have something like maybe possible multiple state and several outcomes. We may have duration dependence, and many times the timing of treatment cannot be ignored. Examples can be cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, dementia, anything that is a chronic disease, right? Traditional regression models are not well suited for this problem. Now, duration models have long been used in this situation, but duration models have problems to estimate, right? Duration models is difficult to allow for endogeneity of treatment or also like the timing and the treatment, yes, and the visit as well, right? It's difficult to account for unmeasured heterogeneity. We may have left and right censoring that is allowable. We also may have partial observability of state, and that's where I'm going to concentrate my presentation today. The partial observability of the state is not only an econometric problem, but also a real substantive issue for analyzing disease progression and treatment. In the medical literature, this is called lead time bias. And what do I mean by lead time bias, right? More frequent testing on average will diagnose a disease presence earlier. But the true duration since the start of the disease will usually be unknown even after its diagnosis. You never know where you really got the disease. Even if the doctor visit have no impact on the disease, one will uncover a statistical relationship suggesting more frequent visits lead to longer survival, even though there is no real effect. For example, in this case, both patients get the disease at the same time and both patients die at the same time. But one patient goes to undergo screening often, and by the screening, undergoing that screening often, will get the disease will detect earlier, while the other patient just wait to have symptoms of the disease before go to the doctor. Now you can see that both will live the same, but one person will live way longer with the disease or knowing that you have the disease compared to the other patient, right? So that thing is going to be called the so-called lead time in the medical literature. So what we did in our work is that we actually wrote a paper and we wrote a model and in which we actually formally model this lead bias, right? So what we did, the paper was published in 2016. So we developed an estimated dynamic multiple stage discrete duration model that controlled for the partial observability of the state. Now, our model also allows for unmeasured heterogeneity using discrete factor models, duration dependence, and rise sensor. And we also apply our model to diabetes and its complication. We use NLTCS data, which have been merged with Medicare claims data. Now, let me say a little bit about diabetes. I'm going to have two slides about diabetes. I'm assuming that most of you already know about diabetes, right? Diabetes is a complex disease potentially affecting several organs of the system, including the eye, the cardiovascular system, the kidney, as well as the legs and feet. The disease progresses through several stages, each with increasing debilitating consequences. Once an individual reaches a more advanced diabetes stage, it is impossible to undo the physiological damage. It is a major issue among the elderly. We know that, right? And the early stage of the disease are typically non-symptomatic, and without intervention, irreversible physiological damage will continue to accrue. In this paper, we're going to focus on diabetic complication of the feet called diabetic neuropathy. We're going to start by classifying the disease into 5 stages. So what we did, we first classified the disease into 5 stages. I hope that you can read this slide. So we're going to have 5 stages. I'm just going to divide that. I'm going to say that we start with healthy, everyone start healthy. Then you can have diabetes only. Then we're going to have something that we call low severity or lower extreme complication, D2. D3 will be medium severity, lower extreme complication, and D4 will be high severity, lower extreme complication. Now, in the third column, in this column, in the total of the condition, you can see how we classify it. And on the last column will be the ICD-9 codes, what we use, right? So we went over that is debatable, but we have to make some classification, and that's what we did. Now, so how do we set up the model? My presentation will be technical. They asked me to do a technical presentation, so I'm doing it, right? So what we did, we divide your life into 103 time periods, right? But the period of interval that we need to study is t equal to 4, because t equal to 4 is when you become, is the quarter when you become age 65. So t equal to 4 will be a quarter, the quarter you turn 65, and after that, t4, t5, 6, they're going to be a quarter of your life. The previous 3 periods, t1 all the way to t equal to 1, all the way to t equal to 3, are just there to allow for you to have diabetes before you turn age 65. So just purely for modeling reasons, right? And it can be an arbitrary period of time. That doesn't have a real fixed period of time. They're only for modeling purposes. Now, we're going to assume that you're going to basically live the period 103, and everyone lived before that because you have to be like over 100 years old, right? So you may live because, okay, you got to the end of the year with our data, or you may have left the sample for some reason, and we're going to have 2 outcomes. We're going to have amputation and death, right? Now, we're going to measure, and this is going to be important variables that we're going to use, are going to be, I need to distinguish between T sub D is the time, sub, right? Sub is the time in which you acquire the disease, right? The time you acquire diabetes, or diabetes neuropathy, and so on, right? And T sub is going to be the difference between the current time and the time that you acquire. So it will be the time with the disease, the real time with the disease, not the time with the disease diagnosed. Is that clear? Now, also starting at period equal to 4, individual can go to the doctor, right? And they can get a screening visit, right? So starting in period equal to 4, from my data, I know if you have diabetes or if you want to visit without diabetes. So we're going to assume they're going to have a screening visit, and that screening visit will tell us if you have the disease or not. Now we're going to distinguish between first visit and subsequent visit, right? The first visit is important. It needs to be treated differently because individuals who already have diabetes are more likely to go to the doctor earlier because you already wanted to make sure that you're into the system and you will see a diagnosis of diabetes in the first visit, right? Now, again, what we're going to assume, that this is going to be a discrete hazard model. Every time period, we're going to estimate a hazard, which is going to be a logic probability, right? So at the beginning, it will be just, If you start healthy, that is for period after period number 4, right? So this is for the regular time periods. Most of the work will be done by the computer. We're going to start healthy. We wanted to go to get diabetes, right? So that will depend, will be a logical probability, which will depend on a vector of demographic and health characteristic that basically we got from NLTCS, right? We also got a few variables from actually it was all from NLTCS, now if I remember correctly. And also will be an unmeasured heterogeneity, which will connect all of the different hazards. So we're going to allow for those things to be correlated, right? I'm going to talk about the measured heterogeneity a little bit later at the end. Now, then after that, we're going to have another hazard, right, for each subsequent progression of the disease. And notice that now, not only will depend on different parameters, but also we're going to add a variable for, we're going to allow for the time with the disease to affect you. Is that clear? And that will be the time with the real disease, not with the time with diagnosed, when the disease was diagnosed. That will be how long have you had diabetes? How long have you had diabetic neuropathy going to the next stage and so on, right? And that is going to be done in a quadratic form. Now, we also have to have a hazard for getting the disease or D1 and D2 before the first visit. So that will be for pre-age 65. Remember, I was telling you we need to model that. So we're going to have hazard there for that. And also we need to have a hazard for the first visit, right? So 4 more equations there, right? Now we also need to have equations. We need to model the visit and the outcomes, right? Now for the visit and the outcome, we could have got this even more complex and do it like visit if you only have your healthy, visit if you have D1, and so on. But what we did here, we allowed the parameters to be basically the same, but we allowed time with the disease to matter, right? To that affect the difference. And same thing with the outcomes. So that was a restriction that we did make. Now, altogether, there are 12 equations to estimate. But first, let me say a little bit about the unmeasured heterogeneity. So the unmeasured heterogeneity, we're going to do it using discrete factors. We're going to assume that EK will be given by the formula K minus 1 divided by capital K minus 1. And then we're going to connect all of them together using this polynomial, right? So here we need to decide which K do we use and which J do we use, right? Ideally, we should use K equal to infinity and J very large, and that will cover everything, but we know that infinity, we're never going to get there. So what we're going to do, we're going to play around with that, and at the end, we're going to settle. I think that is going to be in the next equation. I'm going to talk about more which K and which J do we choose, and we'll talk about later. But overall, we need to estimate 12 equations, right? The likelihood function is going to be messy, but it's straightforward, right? It's not going to be nothing, and we're going to have 12 equations to estimate, but the likelihood function is very straightforward, right? Now, this likelihood function that I'm going to show you first is going to be assuming that you can observe the exact time in which you progress, which is not true in real life, I know, but we need to start with that likelihood function. So assuming that LH is the likelihood function for a person who lives healthy all his life and then dies, right? Or lives without diabetes all his life or her life and then dies. LD1 will be a person who transitioned to diabetes at times TD1, but never progressed to D2 before T, right? And same thing, we can define LD2, LD3, LD4. With these parameters, it's very straightforward to create this likelihood function, right? So notice that this likelihood function will depend on the time that you got D1, the time that you got D2, the time that you got D3, all the way to the time that you got D4, right? Now, this likelihood function assumes that we know the exact day which you got the disease, which we know that is not true, right? So TDJ is not observed in the data. So we need to incorporate what is so-called the partial observability. And we're going to do it by integrating over the possible time during which an individual is known to have progressed to a higher stage. Now, from our Medicare claims data, I can find the visit before you were diagnosed, and then I will find the visit immediately, the visit in which you were diagnosed, right? So that gives me a bracket, right? I give you a bracket of number of quarters in which between this quarter and that quarter, I'm expecting you to have progressed to the disease, right? Now, obviously, if a person who goes to see the doctor often is going to have a smaller bracket compared to a person to go occasionally to see the doctor, right? So that would be that we're going to use that variation to take advantage on to see if those people have better outcome or not. Now, so here I have the integration. So all that I did, I just integrated the likelihood function, right? So we're going to integrate it over all possible starting values, starting and ending values of TDJ. Now, one of the advantages of our method is that now we can calculate the time for which the disease was undiagnosed, right? So that will be the time in which, the time that, say, the time that you have diabetes, but, so the time with the disease undiagnosed will be the minimum between the time with diabetes, the time that you have diabetes, with the maximum that you were diagnosed minus the original day that you started the disease. So that will stop at the time that you got, it was diagnosed, right? So that will be the time in which the disease was undiagnosed, and that will be one of our main explanatory variables that we're going to use in our analysis. Now, we also must integrate over the measured heterogeneity. I didn't show you that slide. That is straightforward, right? So one more integration that we need to do, all of those unmeasured heterogeneity points, right? We derive our own program. Obviously, that doesn't exist, right? There is no CAM program who will do that. So we wrote our Fortran program, which Arsini did most of the coding, and we maximize this likelihood function using the GQPT subroutine, right? Now we report we estimated for different point of heterogeneity and different heterogeneity factors, but the result that we report are going to be with k equal to 8 and j equal to 3. We didn't go beyond those points because it started becoming very unstable and really, really time consuming. So we decided, and the result were not changing as much. So we decided that was a stopping point there. Now I'm going to talk about the results that we got. So we use the National Long-Term Care Survey, which people have talked about this about that survey because I started here, right? And that survey was merged with Medicare claims data from 1982 to 2004 and the National Death Index. We have claimed for over 40,000 individuals. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm not going to go through all of the results in detail. I'm just going to go through the main results, right? And so here, I'm not going to discuss this number, but notice that here I'm only showing the time with undiagnosed diabetes. I'm not showing the other variables, given that, I don't want to have tiny things. But you can see that most of these variables, there are quite a few variables significant there, but they don't mean very much when we just look at the coefficient because we have effect, we have quadratic terms, right? So to do that, we created this calculation of marginal effects, right? And so what we did here, we assuming that everyone started at 65. Now, because one of the advantages of our model, we have a structural parameter, so we can do some simulations to see what happened. So what we did here, we started with everyone at 65 was healthy, and basically everyone got diabetes. I think that was 66 or something like that. And basically, we assumed that you were not diagnosed with diabetes for 1 year, right? So everyone got diabetes at the same time, and you waited 1 year for not getting diabetes, right? To be diabetes undiagnosed. What will happen with you, right? So this is going to be the increase of the probability of going to the next stage. So for example, 1 year later, your probability of a higher stage by year, right, will increase by 0.03, right? Of 1 year delay of your diagnosis of diabetes, right? And then that will have an effect on the next stage, right? But then if you took you 5 years for you to delay, I'm sorry, still it was 1 year delay, but 5 years later, that same problem would have increased by 0.06, right? Then by death, it was started from 0.0001 to 0.0044. Now these numbers, they always have the expected signs, right? So that's the good news. The effects are small, they're not big, but they're not trivial either, right? For example, a 1 year delay in diagnosis of diabetes causes a 6.6 percentage point increase in low severity LEC in 5 years and 44 more deaths per 10,000 individuals, right? Now, we also did another set of simulations, and in this set of simulations, we did the whole. We first used our parameters to simulate how many visits, how many quarters you will be alive, how many quarters you will be with an amputation, how many quarters you will be with less than high LEC, and so on, right? So we did this base set of simulations, and then we did something that, say, for example, Medicare may do, right? So we say, well, suppose that Medicare only will pay for one screening visit per year. You have only one visit, so it will only pay for one visit per year, right? That is the case, you will see that you will save 15.62 visits in a period of 15 years, based on our simulation, based on what we have on the data. Now, then we also did another one in which we allow for 2 visits per year, so one every 6 months, right? And if that is the case, we're going to save 9.53 visits in a period of 15 years. But then, if I have, by the way, here, this number, now I noticed that here there was a mistake. The first row should say only 1 visit per year. The second one should say only 2 visits per year, right? So there is a switch there, right? So it should match the first part. So if you do only 1 visit per year, the probability of being alive, right, will decrease by 0.06 in 15 years. Will decrease by 0.06 quarters, which is equivalent around 6.6 days, right? Now the probability of having a low severity LEC will decrease, will increase, right? So it will go up, right, by 0.15 quarter, which is equivalent around 2 weeks, right? And then you can see the results also for the 1 day. Now we did some back of the envelope calculations, and we figured out that based on these numbers, even though they look small, using standard life and based on people have done about the cost savings, this would put a value, if we put the value of the life around $100,000-$200,000 per year, right? $100,000-$200,000. This is actually is not that cost ineffective, right? So it has some value. So these effects, what I'm saying, they're not huge, but they're not trivial either, right? And I'm going to stop here because I think that I'm having 5 minutes for questions. Yes.
So I was trying to follow what you were saying about the T equal 4, which is the 4 quarters. And then the T1, 2, 3 are all before you get the diagnosis of diabetes. So is this only relates to people that just recently got their diagnosis, or if you encounter someone that comes in, they had the diagnosis, do you have an opportunity to look back?
Okay, we did it because we only have data starting at age 65.
Okay.
And you could have gotten diabetes earlier.
Okay.
So if I have better data, right? If I should have got data, say, starting when you are like 40, I don't know what is the earlier you can get diabetes, right? So if I have data over your lifetime, I will not need to do that, right? So that is just to control. It was just done in the program that control for the left sensor. Some people started with diabetes, right? Left sensor is usually more difficult to model than right sensor, in hazard models. So we needed to do that for the left sensor. For the reason I said that was arbitrary. In the paper, we say, well, we're thinking about 50 years old, but be 5 years period, but they don't have to be 5-year periods. Right?
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
It looks like you couldn't do this analysis of cognition from claims data. Is that right? Or, I mean, you could use like HRS or something like that, but how would you, what are the relationship between this analysis and dementia?
Well, if I could have, if we have like a visit to a doctor who can diagnose the dementia and it has some form of test. I don't know how often, I think that you have to, they give you some test for dementia. And if we see that you visit certain kind of doctor who can have diagnosed that, I could technically apply this program too, right? What we need to have a screening visit, a visit which will screen the disease, right? That's all that we need, right? And for dementia, I'm not super familiar with dementia, but I do believe that there are some tests for that. Yes.
Yeah, so actually, for dementia and Alzheimer's disease per se, there's several ways we could go about it. Now, if we're willing to put up of a relatively small sample size, which is sort of good from a computing standpoint because it takes forever to calculate this model, we actually can use the HRS, which does provide cognition data. It provides it every 2 years, right? And it needs to be supplemented with MDS cognition data because the HRS doesn't question people in long-term care facilities. But this model is directly applicable to the case of Alzheimer's disease and dementia, given we have a data set as rich as the HRS, because we have our undiagnosed period. No one knows when you got Alzheimer's disease. And you're going to act stupid at some point in time, but when you actually got it, God knows, right? And we have testing. In the case of the HRS, it's every 2 years. If you get into a long-term care facility, it's actually going to be a little bit more often than every 2 years. I have to start over again. I was yelling pretty loud. Depending on the source of the screenings, right? If it's the HRS screening, it's every 2 years. If it's MDS, it could be up to quarterly, depending on how lucky you get, right? We have this evaluation and we have a lot of unobserved time. So the brackets are going to be pretty large. 2 years ago, you got tested, you were fine. Right now, you got tested, you have mild cognitive impairment, but maybe in between this bracket, you also got some diagnoses, and these could also be integrated into the model. So the application to Alzheimer's disease and dementia are very direct, actually, but the devil is in the details and actually getting it done and published.
But it sounds like it would be useful to do. Okay, well, thank you. We're actually, are there any more questions? We have 3 minutes.
I'll ask you to clarify, what were you saying that the HRS does not ask if you're in a facility?
You know, once you get into a long-term care facility, HRS stops asking you questions.
I thought
They'll
they had
ask-
proxies.
Yeah, but that's not you. So they'll ask your wife, well, how's your husband doing? And you say, I don't know, I haven't talked to him for 2 years. Right.
It doesn't follow you in a long-term care facility,
Not necessarily, it could be a wife too.
but there's an exit interview.
I thought it was the facility staff.
It could be that, we could look that up, but as far as I know, it could be a wife as well. Doesn't have to be a facility staff.
Okay.
You never know, I mean.
We'll look that up.
I think we had Langa on the list later on. You know.
Okay, well, thank you, Gabrielle.